she had been Luna for 52 years. 52 years of stone corridors and cold councils, of managing a territory that breathed through her and a king who had slowly forgotten how to breathe without her. Of sitting at tables where men twice her age deferred to her judgment. Of loving with the particular fierce stubbornness of a woman who had decided that love was not a feeling, but a daily act of will. 52 years, and it ended in 4 minutes. 4 minutes of a herald's voice reading words that had been sharpened like a blade. Revoked, revoked, revoked. While the woman who had taken her place stood beside the obsidian throne in a garnet gown and laughed. Not a polite laugh, not an embarrassed laugh. A warm, savoring, delighted sound that found every corner of the great hall and came back louder. The court stood and watched and looked at their shoes. And the king, her husband of 52 years, looked somewhere that was not her face. Margaret walked out with her spine straight and her hands still, and her silver hair pinned in the same knot she had worn every morning of her adult life. She did not shatter. But she went to the kitchen to say goodbye, not to the people, but to the place, to the stone oven, to the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, to the 52 years of wood smoke and rosemary that had been the closest thing this castle had ever offered to a home. And in that kitchen, in the far corner behind the bread oven where the light barely reached, and no one had looked in perhaps a century, her foot came down on a floor stone that sounded different from every other floor stone in the castle. She moved the stone. What she found beneath it would change everything. And that was only the beginning. If you love intense wolf stories with destiny and twists, go ahead and subscribe to the channel right now. So subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters. And how about we get to know each other better? I'm Maggie Reed, the author of these stories. And you? Drop a comment below with your name and what city you're watching from. The Great Hall of Castle Veldmore had never felt so cold. Margaret stood at the center of it, her back straight as a spear, her silver hair pinned into the same elegant knot she had worn for 52 years of mornings, 52 years of councils, 52 years of standing beside a king who had once sworn, beneath the light of a full moon, that she would never stand alone. The stone floor beneath her feet was the same floor she had first walked as a trembling young Luna, full of hope and the particular terror of a girl newly bonded to the most powerful alpha in the Eastern Territories. Now she was 73 years old. The trembling this morning had an entirely different cause. She could feel every eye in the hall pressing against her like weight. The assembled court, lords and their consorts, senior advisors in heavy ceremonial robes, guards who had known her name for 3 decades, watched in a silence so dense it seemed to have a texture. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They were all waiting, she knew, for her to shatter. She had not shattered in 73 years. She was not about to begin now. From the far end of the hall, King Alistair cleared his throat. He sat upon the carved obsidian throne the way he always had, shoulders broad even in their slight new hunch. Iron gray hair swept back from a face mapped with decades of authority. The deep-set eyes of a shifter who had ruled long enough to believe ruling was simply what he was. He was 81 years old and still carried the bone-deep gravity of a man accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered them. But this morning, for the first time in 52 years, his eyes did not find hers. They slid past her, around her, anywhere but at her. And beside him, standing in the space to the right of the throne that had been Margaret's since the day of their bonding, the space that had belonged to her longer than some of the people in this room had been alive, stood Morgane. Margaret allowed herself one look, one single, deliberate, unhurried look. Morgane was perhaps 40, and she had dressed for this moment the way a general dresses for a victory parade. A gown the deep color of crushed garnets, copper hair arranged in waves over one shoulder, posture so perfectly composed it could only have been practiced. She was beautiful in the sharp, deliberate way of a woman who had decided long ago that beauty was a tool and had spent years learning how to wield it. Her dark eyes found Margaret's from across the length of the hall immediately, She had clearly been waiting for that. And what lived inside them was not hatred. Hatred, Margaret thought distantly, would have been almost respectful. What Morgane wore in her gaze was the slow, warm pleasure of a woman savoring something she had spent years planning and had finally achieved. The herald beside the throne unrolled his scroll with theatrical solemnity and began to read. Margaret had heard these words 2 nights ago, delivered privately by a pale steward who could not look at her. She had sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with Alistair for half a century and held her own hands in her lap and listened without expression while the fire burned to ash. She had given herself that one night to sit with it, one night to feel the full weight of what 52 years of loyalty, sacrifice, and love had apparently been worth in the end. Now she stood here and listened again, because Alistair, or more precisely, Morgane, had required that it be done publicly. By the authority of the Alpha King of Veldmore and the Eastern Reaches, and in recognition of the new bond of the heart formally acknowledged before the Moon Council, the title, rights, privileges, and protections of Luna are hereby... The word revoked fell into the great hall like a stone dropped from a great height. A breath moved through the room, collective, involuntary. The flinch of old Lord Harwick near the second pillar. The sudden stillness of the guard captain by the west wall, a man who had served under Margaret for 20 years. Lady Merwin, 70 and sharp as a blade, pressed her lips together so tightly the color left them. Robes rustled as people looked at the floor, the ceiling, their own hands, any surface that was not Margaret's face. Then Alistair opened his mouth. For one suspended moment, something moved across his face, a tremor so brief and so quickly suppressed that only someone who had spent half a century learning the precise geography of that face would have caught it. His jaw tightened. His eyes, for the first time all morning, shifted toward her. For one fraction of a second, they actually found her. And in them, buried beneath the authority and the ceremony and the careful blankness he had constructed, Margaret saw something she recognized. Something that looked, impossibly, like a man who had just realized, too late, that he was standing at the edge of something he could not uncross. He opened his mouth. A word formed. Morgane's hand moved to his arm. Her fingers curled around it, not gripping, not pulling, just resting. A whisper of pressure, perfectly timed. Alistair closed his mouth. The moment passed. His eyes slid away from Margaret's again, smooth and final as a door clicking shut, and he settled back into the posture of a king pronouncing a verdict he had already decided, and the court breathed again, and it was over. Except that it was not over, because Morgane stepped forward. It was not required. There was nothing in the ceremony that called for it. But Morgane descended the 2 shallow steps from the dais anyway, slowly, her garnet gown whispering against the stone, and she crossed the open floor until she stood close enough that Margaret could smell her perfume, something heavy and sweet that had no business in a throne room at 9 in the morning, and she looked at Margaret with that expression of warm, savoring delight, and she smiled, and she spoke loud enough for every person in the great hall to hear every single syllable. "Take your memories with you, Margaret." Her voice was smooth as poured oil, every word precise and deliberate, and offered to the room like a gift. "They are the only things here that no one will ever want from you." A beat. Then she laughed, a small, genuine, delighted sound that was somehow worse than any cruelty delivered in anger, because it was so clearly pleasurable, and the echo of it moved through the stone hall and found every corner and came back, and Margaret felt it land in her chest like a blade slid between ribs. The court did not laugh with her, but the court did not speak either. The silence was, in its own way, worse. Margaret looked at Morgane for exactly 3 seconds. She did not drop her gaze. She did not respond. She let the silence stretch just long enough to make clear that the absence of her response was a choice and not an inability, and then she turned and she walked toward the doors, Her footsteps were even. Her spine was straight. Her hands clasped in front of her were absolutely still. From the eastern pillar she felt Leon before she saw him. Her younger son, 34 years old, her gray eyes set into his father's angular face, stood in the shadow with the careful, controlled stillness of a man using every resource he possessed not to move. His jaw was set. His eyes tracked her, and in them she saw something that broke the surface of his composure just long enough for her to read it before he buried it again. A grief so large and so furious that it had apparently taken on a physical weight he was carrying with both hands. She caught his eye. She gave him the smallest, most private shake of her head. Not yet, that look said. Not here. Not now. His throat moved. Something behind his eyes said, I know. I know. But I will fix this. I will stay, and I will watch, and I will learn every move they make. And I will bring you back, even if I have to spend a year pretending to be someone you raised me never to be. She believed him. She always had. The great doors opened before her, protocol or old loyalty or both, and she walked through them into the corridor beyond, and they swung shut behind her with a sound like the closing of a world. The corridor was gray and quiet. Morning light fell in pale bars through the high-slit windows. Margaret stood in it alone and allowed herself exactly 5 full breaths, in and out, steady, deliberate. And then she turned, because she was not going to leave without saying goodbye to the only part of this place that had never asked anything from her except that she show up, and she had always shown up. She walked toward the kitchen. From inside, already, she could hear the signature disaster of Pimiento's morning. The spectacular metallic cascade of what sounded like at least 6 copper pots meeting the stone floor in rapid, enthusiastic succession, followed by a pause, and then his voice, deep, cheerful, entirely unembarrassed, announcing to no one in particular, absolutely magnificent, a personal record. Someone should write that down. Despite everything that was sitting in her chest, the corner of Margaret's mouth moved. She pushed open the kitchen door. The smell came first. Wood smoke and rosemary and fresh bread from the great stone oven, warm and familiar and achingly kind. And she stood in the doorway and breathed it in and let it settle over her like something she was committing to memory. Pimiento, her castle's enormously round and relentlessly optimistic head cook, was on the floor amid a constellation of fallen cookware, gathering pots back onto their rack with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had stopped being surprised by this particular situation approximately 40 years ago. He looked up. His eyes went bright, then careful, then soft, and he opened his mouth and closed it, and then said, more gently than she had expected from a man sitting on a kitchen floor, Your Grace, I had a feeling you'd come through that door. Then I hope you made tea, Margaret said. I made tea, a full breakfast platter, and a very small speech that I will mercifully spare you from. He began, with great dignity, to stand up. Let me just, yes, there we, almost. He achieved vertical, slightly breathless, one pot still somehow balanced on his knee. There, speech cancelled. Tea is ready. She walked the length of the kitchen slowly, trailing the tips of her fingers along the surface of the long central work table, its wood scarred and dark with decades of use, as familiar beneath her hand as the back of her own. She passed the cold storage alcove, the spice cupboard, the iron bread oven with its cracked left door that she had requested be replaced so many times she had stopped counting. She was nearly at the far end of the kitchen, almost to the larder passage, when she felt it. Her foot came down differently. It was a small thing, so small that any other morning, any other person, might have taken another step without noticing. A hollow sound where solid stone should have been. A faint vibration, subtle as a held breath, traveling up through the sole of her shoe. And from the thin gap that ran, she looked down now, she looked around the edges of a floor stone that did not quite align with its neighbors, came a breath of cool air that smelled of something old and mineral and entirely unknown. old stone, dust, and something else beneath it, something that had no name she recognized, something that moved against her senses like a frequency too low to hear, but not too low to feel. Margaret crouched down, her knees protesting mildly and being ignored. She pressed her palm flat against the stone slab. It shifted. Not much, not dramatically, but it shifted, with the particular ease of something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to simply try. From somewhere deep below, in the darkness that the kitchen had been sitting above for perhaps centuries without anyone knowing, something stirred, something breathed. And in her chest, in the place where the eternal moon seal had lived quietly for 52 years, fading these past months like a fire being slowly starved of air, a pulse of warmth moved through her, sudden and clear and unmistakable, like the first real light after a long winter. Margaret's breath caught. She looked into the dark below the stone, and the dark looked back, and it felt, improbably, impossibly, like the beginning of something rather than the end. The stone moved, not gently, not the polite, cooperative shift of something well-maintained and recently oiled. It ground against its neighbors with the deep, reluctant groan of something that had not moved in a very long time and had strong opinions about being disturbed. Dust rose in a thin gray column. The cool air from below pushed upward with sudden pressure, as though the dark had been holding its breath for centuries and had only just been given permission to exhale. Margaret did not step back. She knelt at the edge of the opening and looked down. The gap was perhaps 3 feet wide, just enough. A rough stone staircase descended into darkness, the steps uneven and narrow, worn smooth at their centers in the particular way of stairs that had once seen regular use. The walls on either side were close. The darkness below was absolute. "Your Grace." Pimiento's voice came from behind her, lower than his usual register, which for Pimiento was very unusual indeed. She heard him cross the kitchen floor. She heard him stop. She heard the particular silence of a man looking at something he had not expected and reassessing his morning accordingly. "That," he said after a moment, "was not there yesterday." "It was there yesterday," Margaret said. "It was there before either of us was born." She pressed her hand to the edge of the opening. The stone was cold, but beneath the cold was something else, a faint vibration, rhythmic and low, like a heartbeat heard through a wall. "We simply never looked." Right. Yes, very wise. "Are you going down there?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "I'm going to need a moment to locate my courage. It may be behind the flour sacks." The sound of shuffling. Then, "Found it. Right behind the flour sacks. As predicted. I'm coming with you." She almost stopped him. Almost. But the truth was that the thought of descending alone into something this old and this unknown, on the worst morning of her life, with nothing but her own composure for company, she found that she did not want that. She wanted Pimiento's absurd, indestructible cheerfulness and his accidentally heroic loyalty, even if he described his own bravery as something stored behind the flour sacks. "Bring a lamp," she said. He was back in 30 seconds with 2 good heavy kitchen lamps, oil-filled, burning steady. He handed one to her. She took it and descended first, because she was not the kind of woman who sent someone else down a dark staircase before her, and the stairs held her weight without protest, and the dark came up around her like cold water, and she did not stop. The staircase turned once, then again, dropping deeper than she had expected, deeper than the kitchen, deeper than the castle's foundation level, down into something that predated the structure above. The walls changed texture as she went, the fitted stone of the castle giving way to rougher, older work, and then to something older still, irregular, massive blocks that had been set without mortar, held in place by their own weight and by centuries of patience. Marks had been carved into them. She lifted her lamp as she moved and saw them. Symbols she did not recognize, repeating in bands around the passage walls, worn smooth by time but still present, still deliberate. Then the stairs ended, and she stepped into the room. It was large, far larger than the staircase had suggested, opening out into a circular chamber perhaps 40 feet across, with a ceiling that arched high above her head and walls lined floor to ceiling with the same carved symbols. But it was what occupied the center of the room that stopped her feet and stopped her breath, and stopped briefly the considerable internal machinery of her composure. In the center of the chamber, mounted on a plinth of black stone, was a mirror. Not an ordinary mirror. It was perhaps 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, framed in something that was not quite silver and not quite bone. A material she could not identify, carved into interlocking shapes of wolves and moons and something in between. Figures caught mid-transformation, forever incomplete. The glass, if it was glass, was dark. Not reflective. Dark in the way of deep water, the kind of dark that suggests depth rather than emptiness. And it was humming, low, continuous, felt more in the sternum than heard with the ears. The same frequency she had felt through the floor stone upstairs, except here it was unmistakable, and it was not fading. If anything, as she took another step toward it, it intensified. "Oh," said Pimiento from immediately behind her, in the voice of a man updating his worldview in real time. That is something." "Yes," Margaret said. She walked toward it. She should not have. She knew, with the instinctive knowledge of a woman who had spent 73 years in a world threaded through with old power, that you did not approach objects like this without knowing what they were. But the warmth in her chest, the pulse of the eternal moon seal that had moved through her upstairs, was moving again, stronger now, a steady rhythmic insistence that felt less like a warning and more like a recognition, like something calling her forward by name. She stopped at the base of the plinth. Up close, the mirror's frame was covered in writing, tiny, dense script in a language she almost recognized, almost could read, the way one sometimes almost understands a word in a dream. She raised her lamp, held it close. And there, at the very base of the frame, in letters slightly larger and more deeply cut than the rest, she read 5 words in the old tongue, a language she had been taught as a girl, a language no one had spoken in this castle in living memory. She who was wronged returns. The mirror's surface rippled. Not a reflection. There was no image in it, no Margaret looking back at herself. Just a slow, deep ripple, like a stone dropped into dark water, moving outward from the center in rings. And then, from somewhere within that darkness, light. A pale, bluish, sourceless light that gathered itself slowly in the center of the mirror and began to take on shape. A shape that was not a reflection. A shape that was something else entirely. "Your Grace," Pimiento said, and his voice had gone completely flat with the particular calm of a man who had moved past fear into a place where only focused attention remained. "Something is coming up the stairs behind us." Margaret did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the mirror, on the gathering light, on the shapes beginning to form within it. Figures moving, images she could not yet resolve. A story she was beginning to understand was older than the castle, older than Alistair's line, older perhaps than any claim to any throne. "How many?" she said. The sound from the staircase was unmistakable now. Boots on stone, moving fast, not bothering with quiet. "At least 4, Pimiento said. He had picked up a heavy iron pot from somewhere, which she noted with peripheral vision and chose not to question. "Possibly 6. Someone upstairs noticed we went down." More gain, Margaret thought. She has eyes in the kitchen. Of course she does. She has eyes everywhere. The light in the mirror pulsed, once sharp and bright, like a signal. And in that pulse, Margaret saw, clearly and for just a moment, an image. A woman standing in this very chamber, young and silver-haired and fierce, pressing her palm to the mirror's surface while the world above her burned. The same chamber, the same mirror, another lifetime. The footsteps hit the bottom of the stairs. Margaret turned. 4 guards filled the entrance of the chamber, large, armed, wearing the red and black livery of the king's personal detail rather than the silver of the castle guard. Not Alistair's men, Morgaine's men, which was a distinction that mattered enormously. The one at the front was tall enough to scrape the chamber's entrance with the top of his head. He looked at Margaret. He looked at the mirror. He looked back at Margaret. "By order of Lady Morgaine," he said, "you are to come with us. Both of you." Pimiento raised the pot. "I have a counter-proposal," he said pleasantly. And Margaret, 73 years old and freshly stripped of every title she had ever held, looked at the 4 armed men blocking the only way out of an ancient chamber beneath her former castle, and felt, beneath the cold and the fear and the fury, something she had not felt in years. She felt interested. "I don't think," she said in the voice she had used for 52 years to end arguments in throne rooms, "that we'll be going anywhere with you today." The tall guard took 1 step forward. Margaret did not move. She stood at the base of the mirror's plinth with her lamp in her hand and her spine straight, and her eyes fixed on the man as though he were a minor inconvenience she was deciding whether to address now or later. Behind her, the mirror hummed. The pale blue light within it had not faded. If anything, it had steadied, gathering itself into something purposeful, something that pressed warmly against the back of her neck like a second presence in the room that had decided to stand behind her. "Lady Morgaine's orders carry no authority over me," Margaret said. Her voice did not rise. It never had to. "She holds no title that grants her command of the king's guard, and these men—" She let her gaze move, briefly and deliberately, across each of the 4 faces in the doorway. "Are wearing the king's colors, not hers. So either my husband has sent you himself, in which case I would like to hear it from him, or someone is borrowing authority she does not possess, which is, I will note, a punishable offense under castle law." A beat of silence. The tall guard's jaw worked slightly. He had clearly not been briefed for this particular version of events. "Take them," said a voice from behind the guards. A 5th person, hanging back in the stairwell shadows, whose presence Margaret had suspected from the moment she heard the footsteps. A woman's voice, low and precise. Not Morgaine herself, a proxy. Someone trusted enough to be sent, careful enough to stay out of sight. "The king has been informed. He has approved it." He approved it, Margaret thought. And the part of her that had still, despite everything, held some small warm ember of doubt, some vestigial hope that Alistair's hesitation in the throne room had meant something, felt that ember go quietly, finally, cold. Good, she thought. Good. Clarity was a gift, even when it arrived like this. The tall guard moved. He was fast, shifter fast, crossing half the distance between them before a human eye would have registered he'd started. But Margaret had spent 52 years living among shifters, sleeping beside one, raising 2, governing a court full of them, and she had long since stopped being impressed by fast. She stepped aside, precisely and without hurry, exactly far enough, the way one steps aside for a cart on a narrow road. And the guard's momentum carried him 2 steps past her before he could correct, his shoulder clipping the edge of the plinth hard enough to make him stagger. The mirror flared, not a gradual brightening, a sudden total pulse of white-blue light that filled the entire chamber, and in that pulse the carvings on the walls blazed as though lit from within, and the symbols that Margaret had not been able to read resolved, for exactly 1 second, into something she could. The bond stands. The seal holds. She who was wronged has returned to claim witness. Then Pimiento swung the pot. He was not, by any measure, a trained fighter. What he was, however, was a very large man who had spent 50 years lifting heavy things in a professional capacity, and he swung the pot with the committed, whole-body enthusiasm of someone who had decided that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it thoroughly. The second guard took it across the shoulder and went sideways into the third with a crash that echoed magnificently off the ancient stone walls. "Apologies," Pimiento announced, already winding up again. "Occupational hazard!" The fourth guard had his eyes on the mirror, on the light still pouring from it, on the carvings still glowing, on the words burning in the stone. And he had stopped moving entirely. His face had gone the color of old ash. Shifters, Margaret had learned long ago, had a relationship with old magic that was deeply instinctive and not always brave. Whatever this chamber was, whatever the mirror was, his body knew it was older and larger than anything he'd been sent here to handle. "What is this place?" he said. "It is mine," Margaret said. She did not know yet if that was true, but it felt true, the way the warmth in her chest had been growing since she'd first touched that floorstone upstairs, steady and sure as a tide coming in. "And I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next." The voice in the stairwell said something sharp and urgent. The tall guard had recovered, rubbing his shoulder, and his expression had shifted from professional confidence to something more complicated, the look of a man caught between orders and instincts and not finding the choice easy. Then something changed in the mirror. The pale light contracted, pulling inward, concentrating in the center of the glass. And from that concentrated point, an image expanded outward like a breath-fogging cold air. An image so clear it might have been a window rather than a mirror. A hallway in the castle above. A specific hallway, the corridor outside the East Council chamber. And in that corridor, caught in the mirror's image with the total fidelity of something that did not lie, Lord Dorian, Morgaine's shadow, her unseen collaborator, the man whose existence the court pretended not to know. Standing in close, urgent conference with Prince Caden, both of them bent over a document, both of them unaware they were being observed. Both of them wearing expressions that had no innocent explanation. The fourth guard stared at the image. Then he looked at Margaret. "That's—" he started. "Yes," she said. The tall guard looked. The third guard, hauling himself up from the floor, looked. The silence that followed was the silence of men recalibrating. From the stairwell, the voice said, "What's happening? Report." Nobody reported. Margaret studied the image in the mirror for 3 more seconds, committing every detail to memory. The document, the seal visible at its corner, the specific tension in Caden's hands that she recognized from his childhood as the tension he carried when he was doing something he knew was wrong and had decided to do anyway. Then she turned to the 4 guards. "You were sent here by a woman who has no authority and a man who has lost his judgment," she said quietly. "I am not your enemy. I never was. And what that mirror just showed you," she gestured toward the image now fading, "is the reason why." The tall guard looked at the mirror, looked at her, looked at Pimiento, who gave him a small, sincere nod while still holding the pot. "What do you need from us?" the tall guard said. From the shadow of the stairwell, the female proxy turned and ran. Margaret heard her go. She did not pursue. Instead, she looked at Pimiento, who was already thinking ahead. She could see it. That particular narrowing of his eyes that happened when he was calculating something involving logistics. "She'll go straight to Morgaine," he said. "Yes. So we have perhaps 20 minutes before this chamber has more visitors than we can manage." She turned back to the mirror. The image was gone, the light settling back to its steady blue hum, but the warmth in her chest had not faded. "Which means we have 20 minutes to understand what this is." She pressed her palm flat against the mirror's surface. It did not ripple this time. It opened, or something that felt like opening, a sense of depth suddenly present where there had been solid resistance, as though a door had been there all along and her hand had simply found the handle. And from somewhere below the chamber, below the foundations, below anything that should have had a below, a voice spoke, ancient, unhurried, carrying the specific patience of something that had been waiting so long it had stopped counting the years. 73 winters, it said. You took your time. Margaret exhaled slowly. I had a husband to manage, she said. The voice did not laugh, but something in it shifted, a warmth, subtle and immense, like sunlight moving behind clouds. The seal recognizes you, it said. It has been diminishing since the moment he turned from you. The territory feels it. The forests at the eastern border have been thinning for 6 months. The winter wolves have been moving west. The elder trees in the Veldmore Grove are losing bark on the north side, the side that faces the castle. Margaret's hand was still flat against the mirror's surface, and through the glass, through whatever the glass was, she could feel the truth of it. A vast, slow wrongness spreading outward from Castle Veldmore in every direction, gradual enough that no single person had put it together, fast enough that anyone paying attention to the land could feel it. How long? She asked. If the seal extinguishes completely, if you are gone from this land for too long, or if you surrender your claim, perhaps 2 more seasons before the territory begins to truly fail. The Alpha who holds the throne without the Luna it was built for holds an empty vessel, power without root. Behind her, she heard Pimiento make the specific sound of a man absorbing information that was larger than he had anticipated. I'm going to need, he said carefully, to sit down. Not yet, but soon. Margaret pulled her hand from the mirror. She turned to the 4 guards, who were ranged in a loose half-circle, all of them watching her with the focused attention of men who had come here to do one job and found themselves conscripted into something considerably larger. What are your names? She said. They told her. She looked at each face as she heard each name, the way she had always done, committing them, weighting them, making clear that these were not interchangeable pieces of castle furniture, but specific people she was now addressing specifically. You have a choice, she said. You can go back upstairs and tell Morgaine's proxy what you found here, and what happens to this territory happens, and you'll have been a part of it. Or you can help me. You don't have to decide now. But you have... She glanced at Pimiento. 14 minutes, he said, with the confidence of a man who had spent 50 years managing kitchen timing. 14 minutes, she agreed. 3 of the 4 guards looked at each other. Some wordless conversation passed between them, the specific shorthand of men who had served together long enough to think in parallel. The tall guard, whose name was Aldous, she had just learned, 28 years old, from a border village in the Eastern Reach, said, We stay. Good, she thought. She turned back to the mirror. The document. The one you showed me in the corridor. What was it? The mirror's surface shifted again. The image returned, sharper this time, held steadily rather than flashing past. The document in the corridor, Caden's hands braced on either side of it, Dorian's finger tracing a line of text. And now, with the mirror holding it still, she could read the seal at the bottom, could read the heading, Petition for Accelerated Succession. Her breath went somewhere cold and still. Not a petition for Alistair to step down gracefully in his own time, not the ordinary mechanisms of hereditary rule, the slow and dignified transition she had always known Caden was waiting for. This was a petition to the Moon Council, the ancient supernatural authority that governed the Shifter Kingdoms, older than any individual throne, arguing that the king had become unfit, that the territory was destabilizing, and that immediate transfer of power was required for the health of the realm. Not wrong, exactly. The mirror had just told her the same thing, in different words. But Caden had written it 6 months ago. While Alistair was still sending Margaret flowers on the anniversary of their bonding, the small, habitual tenderness of a man who had not yet fully become what Morgaine was making him. Before the formal revocation, Before any of this, Caden had known. He had helped build it. He and Dorian together, she said. Not a question. The mirror confirmed it without words, just a deepening of the image, a second document layering beneath the first. Correspondence between Caden and Dorian stretching back nearly a year, patient and methodical, a man and his mother's lover's architect building a transfer of power brick by careful brick, while Margaret had been running councils and managing boarders and raising sons, and trusting that the walls of her own home were not being quietly disassembled around her. Pimiento said very softly, "Oh, the nerve." Then the sound came from upstairs, not 4 sets of boots this time, but many. Organized. Moving with purpose. Aldous said, "They've sent the full detail." Margaret looked at the mirror, looked at the passage in the far wall that she had only just noticed, narrow and dark, leading somewhere the mirror's light had briefly illuminated when the chamber first activated. An exit that was not the stairs they'd come down. An exit that had been here, patient and waiting, for as long as the chamber itself. She looked at Pimiento. He had already identified the passage. Of course he had. "There's a full breakfast somewhere that is getting cold," he said, "and I intend to be alive to eat it." She almost smiled. "The mirror," said Aldous, his voice uncertain for the first time, but urgent. "Can we take it with us?" "No," Margaret said. She placed her palm against it one more time, quick, decisive, and felt the seal respond, felt something in the mirror's deep old mechanism recognize the contact and file it, the way a lock recognizes the right key and holds the memory of it. "But it knows where to find me now." Then she turned and she walked toward the passage in the far wall, and the guards fell in around her, and Pimiento took the rear with his lamp and his pot, and the mirror behind them hummed once. Low, resonant, the note of something very old that has finally begun to move again. And the dark beyond the passage opened and swallowed them whole, just as the first boots hit the bottom of the stairs. 20 seconds later, the chamber was empty. The mirror glowed softly in the abandoned silence. On its surface, slowly, a new image formed and held. A tall man in a traveling coat, standing outside a village gate, his face turned toward the castle on the hill, with the particular expression of someone who does not yet know he is about to become important. The mirror watched him for a long moment. Then it went dark. The village of Ashford Hollow sat at the base of the Veldmore Ridge, like something that had grown there naturally. Low stone houses with thick walls, a market square with a well at its center, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys into the gray morning air. It was the kind of place that did not appear on military maps because no one had ever considered it worth marking, which was precisely why Margaret had known, the moment the passage beneath the castle had opened into a root cellar behind the miller's house, that this was where they were meant to surface. She had been here twice in her life, both times, years ago, for quiet reasons. She remembered the well. She remembered the baker on the corner whose bread smelled of anise. She remembered almost nothing else, which meant that Morgaine's people, mapping her habits and haunts, would remember even less. They emerged from the cellar one at a time, Aldous first, then the other 3 guards, then Margaret, then Pimiento, who got briefly stuck in the doorframe and resolved the situation with dignity, and stood in the cold morning air behind the miller's house while their eyes adjusted and their lungs processed the difference between centuries-old underground air and November above ground. "Right," said Pimiento, brushing stone dust from his apron with the focused attention of a man restoring order to the universe. "Next steps." "We need shelter," Margaret said. "Somewhere they won't think to look before nightfall. And we need to know—" She stopped. At the far end of the lane that ran alongside the miller's house, a man was standing with his back to them, looking up at the castle on the ridge. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, in a traveling coat that had seen genuine weather. Not the decorative traveling coats of castle men, but the real kind, worn soft and dark at the cuffs. His hair was silver brown, cut close. He stood with the particular stillness of someone who was thinking hard about something and had temporarily forgotten to look like he wasn't. One of Aldis's men started to move toward him. Margaret put out a hand. "Wait," she said. Something moved in her chest, not the seal's warmth exactly, but adjacent to it, a kind of recognition that had no logical source. She studied the man's back for a moment, the set of his shoulders, the way he was looking at the castle, not with the hunger of an ambitious man, not with the wariness of an enemy, but with the specific sorrow-edged attention of someone who had lost something to that building and had not yet made peace with the fact. "Who is he?" she asked Aldis quietly. Aldis looked. Something moved across his face. "Lord Thierry of the Ashford Border Reach," he said, keeping his voice low. "Mira's father. He's been in the village 3 days. Came in from the Western Territory. Word is, he's been trying to get an audience with Prince Leon, but the castle's been—" He paused, choosing the word. "Unavailable." Mira's father. Leon's Mira. The young woman who had been in the back of Margaret's mind since the moment her younger son had first brought her home 2 years ago. Quiet and perceptive, and kind, in a way that was not softness, but something stronger than softness. Something that had looked at Margaret with clear eyes and said, without words, "I see you. I know what this family has cost you. I intend to help." Thierry turned around. He had the kind of face that had clearly been striking at 40 and had grown into something better. Not softer, not harder, but more settled, more fully itself. Gray eyes, the same gray as the morning sky behind the castle. A jaw that carried some old tension he'd apparently decided to simply live with. He looked at the cluster of people behind the miller's house with a quick assessing gaze that took in the guard's livery, the dust on Margaret's dress, the iron pot still in Pimiento's hand, and arrived at a conclusion that most people would have taken considerably longer to reach. He crossed the distance between them in 12 steps. "You're Leon's mother," he said. Not a question. "I am," Margaret said. He looked at her for a moment, at her silver hair, her straight back, her dust-covered dignity, and something in his gray eyes shifted. Not pity. She would have shut the conversation down immediately for pity. What it was, she identified a half-second later, was fury. Quiet. Controlled. The kind that had been banked down under deliberate patience for a long time and was now finding something to attach to. "I've been trying to get through those gates for 3 days," he said. "They told me Leon was unavailable. They told me Mira's last message hadn't arrived. They told me—" He stopped, recalibrated. "They lied to me." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "They've been lying to a great many people." His jaw worked once. Then he looked at the 4 guards, at Pimiento, back at Margaret. "What do you need?" he said. And there it was. The same question Aldis had asked in the chamber, the same question in a different voice. And the fact that it was the same question told her something she filed carefully and did not examine too closely yet, because this was not the moment. "Shelter," she said. "Information. And someone who knows the border road west without using the main pass." "I know every road west," Thierry said. "My family has held the border reach for 4 generations. I know paths that aren't on any map Caden or Dorian has ever seen." He paused. "I'm also going to need someone to explain the iron pot." "That," said Pimiento, "is a long story with an excellent middle section." Thierry's lodgings were at the edge of the village. A rented room above the cooperage, spare and practical, smelling of cedar and wood smoke. He moved through it with the efficiency of a man who traveled often and had learned not to accumulate things, producing a map from a saddlebag and spreading it across the table, while Margaret and Aldis leaned over it, and Pimiento discovered, with audible relief, that there was a small hearth and the supplies to make tea. The map was hand-drawn, detailed in a way that official maps never were. annotated in a small, precise script with notes about seasonal flooding and patrol schedules and the 3 locations where the border fence had gaps wide enough to walk a horse through. "Caden doesn't know about these," Thierry said, his finger tracing the western route. "I made sure of it. When Mira told me about him, about what he was doing, what he and Dorian were building, I started preparing, 3 months ago." Margaret looked up from the map. "Mira knew 3 months ago?" "Mira has known for 6 months," Thierry said. He met her eyes steadily without apology. "She was going to tell Leon when she was certain. She needed proof, not suspicion." Margaret absorbed this. Her future daughter-in-law, quiet and clear-eyed, had been gathering evidence in silence for half a year while the plot closed around Margaret like a fist. She felt something complicated move through her, gratitude and grief, and a sharp, particular pride. "She didn't tell me," Margaret said. "She was protecting you," Thierry said. "She said that if you knew and reacted, it would accelerate everything before the proof was solid. She said—" A pause, something briefly unguarded in his voice. "She said you were the kind of woman who would rather fight than wait, and that sometimes waiting is the only thing that wins." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong," she admitted. The ghost of something crossed Thierry's face, too brief to name, but warm enough to feel, even across the table, even in this small spare room above a cooperage in a village that didn't appear on military maps. Then Aldous said sharply, "Movement on the Ridge Road. 2 riders moving fast." Everyone at the table went still. Thierry rolled the map in one clean motion and had it back in his saddlebag before Aldous finished speaking. He straightened, looked at Margaret, and the unguarded warmth was gone, replaced by something clear and focused and entirely capable. "The east passage through the cooperage connects to the grain store," he said. "The grain store has a back door to the paddock. There are horses in the paddock." A beat. "Mine are faster." Margaret looked at him. "You've been planning for this too," she said. "I've been planning," he said, "for the day Leon's mother needed somewhere safe to go. I just didn't expect it to be today." Pimiento set down his tea with the specific expression of a man who had been watching something develop and had opinions about it. "Fascinating," he said, to no one in particular. "Now, horses?" Inside Castle Veldmore, the corridors had teeth. Leon had always known this. Had known it the way children raised in complicated places know the particular danger of each room before they can name it. But in the 3 days since his mother had walked out of the Great Hall, the teeth had gotten sharper, more visible. Morgane had moved through the castle like a woman who had stopped pretending to be anything other than what she was. And what she was, Leon now understood with total clarity, was someone who had never wanted Alistair at all. She wanted the throne. Alistair was the key. And now that the door was open, the key was becoming inconvenient. He watched her from the appropriate distances. He smiled at the appropriate times. He attended every council session that Caden convened in their father's name. Caden, who had been occupying the council chamber with increasing frequency and decreasing pretense of it being temporary. And he sat at the table and offered opinions that were careful and slightly wrong in ways that seemed like honest errors. And he watched everyone in that room the way his mother had taught him to watch people when he was 7 years old. Not their mouths, Leon. Their hands. Their hands always know more than their mouths do. Caden's hands these days were always busy. Shuffling documents, passing sealed messages, tapping rapid, impatient rhythms on table surfaces. Caden was a man who had been patient for a very long time and had recently allowed himself to stop. And the energy of that release was everywhere in him, spilling out through his fingers because he couldn't stop it coming out somewhere. Dorian attended the council sessions now, officially as Morgane's representative. Leon noted the first time this happened and did not react. He noted how Caden deferred to Dorian's suggestions, small, incremental, always reasonable sounding, and how the council members who had been loyal to Margaret were, one by one, finding their positions quietly restructured. Not removed. Never anything so obvious. Restructured. Given new portfolios that took them away from the center. Given responsibilities in the far reaches that required travel. Given, in short, the castle's version of being walked out through the great hall while everyone watched. On the second day, a servant found him in the east corridor, with a folded note pressed into his palm between one heartbeat and the next. The contact barely a brush, so practiced he almost missed it. He waited until he was alone to open it. She's safe. Village. Moving west tonight. Don't react. Sire! He stood with the note in his hand for long enough to breathe through the relief that moved through him like something physically painful, because relief after 3 days of not knowing had a physical weight that surprised him even now. Then he burned it in the nearest candle and kept walking. Tish found him that evening. She was 24, his mother's personal maid for 6 years, and she had the particular gift of being precisely as invisible as the situation required. A gift she had apparently spent years quietly developing for reasons that were now paying dividends. She materialized at his elbow in the library as though she had simply been there all along and handed him a cup of tea without comment. "You look," she said, sitting down across from him with the familiarity of someone his mother had trusted, "like a man who has been performing a role for 3 days straight without intermission." "I'm fine," he said. "You have a tells," she said. "You press your thumbnail into your index finger when you're suppressing something. You've been doing it for 3 days. She folded her hands on the table. "Your mother would want to know you're sleeping. My mother is currently moving west with Lord Thierry and 4 guards and your future father-in-law's apparently excellent horses," Tish said. "Yes, I know." She took a sip of her tea with the composure of someone delivering information she had verified thoroughly. "I have my own channels." Leon looked at her. "How long have you been running your own channels?" he said. "Since about 3 months after I started working for your mother," Tish said simply. "She never asked me to. I just noticed things. Started writing them down. Started noticing who was talking to whom and what changed after. Your mother is the best person I've ever worked for. I wasn't going to watch what was happening and do nothing." Something in his chest moved, a loosening of a thing that had been pulled very tight. "What do you know?" he said. She told him. She had been noting Morgaine's movements for 8 months, where she went, who she met privately, the specific hours when Dorian visited through the servant's entrance, the documents that came through the castle's internal post that had been handled in Caden's study before reaching their addressees. She had been building a record with the quiet, methodical focus of someone who understood that individual facts were fragile, but accumulated evidence was stone. The petition for accelerated succession was not the only document. There was a second petition, this one addressed not to the Moon Council, but to the ancient office of the Territorial Arbiter, a role that most people believed had been dissolved 2 centuries ago. It had not been dissolved. It had been dormant. And Dorian, apparently, had spent considerable time and effort discovering how to reactivate it. The Arbiter has the authority to convene a review of any Alpha's fitness to hold territory, Tish said. If convened, it supersedes the Moon Council. It supersedes hereditary rule. It can, in theory, appoint an entirely new governance structure. She looked at him steadily. Caden's name is on the second petition as proposed Provisional Alpha. Dorian is named as Arbiter's Council. Leon was quiet for a moment. "And Morgaine?" he said. "Luna Designate," Tish said. "It's all there, written down. Signed." A beat. "They've been very thorough." They had been. He could feel the architecture of it, the patience of it, the long, quiet, merciless patience of people who had decided years ago what they wanted and had moved toward it one careful step at a time while everyone around them lived their lives and trusted the walls. "I need copies," he said. "I already made them," Tish said. She produced from her apron pocket a folded packet, thick and precise. 3 sets. 1 for you. 1 already sent to Lord Thierry's contact in the Western Reach. 1 in a location I will tell you if something happens to me. He looked at the packet in his hand. Then he looked at her. Tish, he said. Yes? Thank you. She picked up her tea again with the manner of someone who had said everything necessary and saw no reason to add to it. Your mother used to say that loyalty is a verb, not a noun. A small pause. I always thought that was worth taking seriously. From somewhere below, in the body of the castle, a door slammed, hard, urgent, the specific slam of news arriving faster than expected. Leon was on his feet before the echo died. Tish was already moving toward the library's secondary exit, packet tucked out of sight, face reorganized into perfect, practiced invisibility. Cadence called an emergency council, she said without turning. Something has happened with the Moon Council's representative. He arrived this afternoon, unannounced. A pause at the door. He's asking for the Luna. Leon went very still. There is no Luna, he said. My father revoked the title. Yes, said Tish. The Moon Council representative seems to find that interesting. She looked back at him, and for just a moment, something bright and fierce showed through her composure. The Moon Council, it seems, was not consulted. The door closed behind her. Leon stood alone in the library with Tish's packet in his hands and the sound of the castle shifting around him. The sound of a structure built on a false foundation beginning, finally, to feel the weight of what it had been asked to hold. And for the first time in 3 days, he allowed himself to think. Soon. He pressed his thumbnail into his index finger one last time, felt the familiar small pain of it, and deliberately stopped. The Moon Council's representative had not come alone. Leon understood this the moment he stepped into the council chamber and felt the quality of the silence, not the silence of men waiting for a meeting to begin, but the silence of men who had already been surprised and were still processing it. Caden sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on its surface, and his expression controlled in the way of someone applying pressure to a wound. Dorian stood behind him, slightly to the left, always slightly to the left, always just outside the center, always in the position of the man who was not officially there. Morgane was absent, which meant she had been warned and had chosen to be elsewhere, which meant she already knew this was not going to go well and had decided not to be visibly attached to it. 3 Moon Council representatives, as it turned out. Not 1. They sat on the far side of the table with the composed authority of people who answered to a law older than any room they walked into. The eldest of them, a woman perhaps Margaret's age, with the particular stillness of someone who had been doing this work for decades, had a ledger open in front of her and a pen in her hand, and the expression of an auditor who has found a discrepancy and is deciding how long to let it breathe before naming it. Prince Leon, she said as he took his seat. Thank you for joining us. Elder Sylvain, he said. He knew her name. His mother had spoken of her, not often, but with the particular respect reserved for people whose judgment Margaret considered genuinely worth trusting. I understand there's a matter of some urgency. There are several, Elder Sylvain said pleasantly. She turned one page in her ledger, then another. We'll begin with the simplest. The Eternal Moon Seal, which, as I'm sure everyone at this table knows, is the ancestral compact that binds the health of Veldmore territory to the legitimate Luna, has been registering significant deterioration for the past 6 months. She looked up. The Moon Council monitors the seals of all Eastern territories. It is our function. We noticed. Caden said, the seal's condition is a territorial matter. The seal's condition, Elder Sylvain said, with the gentle, immovable quality of someone who has heard this argument before and found it unpersuasive, is a Moon Council matter. It has been a Moon Council matter since the original compact was written, which was, she turned another page, approximately 400 years before your family's line was granted this territory. We have some institutional memory on the subject. Dorian shifted behind Caden. It was a small movement, but Leon caught it. A recalculation happening in real time. The slight adjustment of a man whose plan has encountered an obstacle he had not mapped. Furthermore, Elder Sylvain continued, the revocation of Aluna's title without Moon Council consultation is... Let me find the precise language. She did not actually look at the ledger. Invalid. Under Compact Article 7, which has been in continuous effect since the territory's founding, the dissolution of a Luna bond requires the Council's formal review and consent. No such review was requested. No such consent was given. She looked at Caden, which means that as of this moment, the revocation has no standing under Moon Law, and Luna Margareth retains her title, her rights, and her protections in full. The silence that followed was the silence of a very large stone hitting very deep water. Caden's jaw was tight. His hands on the table were still, but only because he was making them still. My father is the Alpha King, he said. His authority is subject to the compact, Elder Sylvain said, as it always has been, as your father knew when he accepted the territory. She closed the ledger. Now, we would like to speak with Luna Margareth directly. I understand she is not currently in the castle. I would like to know where she is. Every face in the room turned, in some degree, toward Leon. Leon looked at Elder Sylvain with an expression of cooperative concern and said, I've been trying to reach her myself. The circumstances of her departure were abrupt. I'm deeply worried about her well-being. He held the elder's gaze steadily. If the Moon Council has resources to help locate her, I would be grateful for that assistance. Elder Sylvain looked at him for a moment with eyes that were doing considerably more work than her expression suggested. Then, very slightly, she nodded. She believed him, Leon thought. Or rather, she understood him. She understood the difference between a lie and a careful truth in a room full of enemies. And she was choosing to accept the careful truth because she needed him functional and in place more than she needed the direct answer right now. We'll be in residence for 3 days, she said. We expect Luna Margareth to be available for consultation within that time. It was not a request. Leon found Tish in the kitchen corridor 20 minutes later, the route they had established in the first 2 days as their safest intersection point, the place where his presence and hers could both be explained by entirely ordinary reasons. She appeared from the direction of the cold storage alcove with a basket of herbs and the expression of a woman who had already heard. 3 days, she said quietly, without preamble. 3 days, he confirmed. Get word to Thierry. My mother needs to know about the compact article. She needs to know the revocation has no standing. She needs to know the Moon Council is on her side. Tish nodded once. Then, Caden has called a private session with Dorian tonight. I have eyes in the room. What are they going to do? Try to find her first, Tish said. Dorian has trackers. 3 of them from the western borderlands. They arrived this morning. I assumed they were guests, but the livery is wrong. She looked at him. They're good, Leon. Real trackers, not castle guards. Leon's mind moved quickly through the map of the western routes, the paths Thierry had mentioned, the terrain, Thierry's horses, the 3-day window, the distance. How quickly can your message reach them? He said. By morning, Tish said. If I send it now. Send it now. She turned to go. He caught her elbow. Light. Brief. The 3rd copy, he said. The one in the location you'll tell me if something happens to you. She met his eyes. It's in the bread oven, she said. The left side, behind the cracked door, in a ceramic jar that's been there since before I started working here. Pimiento knew about the jar. He always baked around it. He never asked me what was in it. Despite everything, Leon felt something that was almost a laugh move through him. Of course he did, he said. Then footsteps rounded the corner. Purposeful, Caden's stride, unmistakable, and Tish became invisible again, basket on her arm, entirely focused on the herbs. And Leon turned toward his brother with an expression of mild fraternal acknowledgement, and the corridor held its breath, and the castle's teeth pressed a little closer. The safe house was 3 hours west of Ashford Hollow, tucked into a fold of the ridge like something the landscape had swallowed deliberately. A stone farmhouse, abandoned for years, its roof still sound, its hearth still usable, its location known to Thierry because his father had used it for border negotiations 2 generations back, and Thierry had been the kind of boy who memorized the things his father considered important. Margaret stood at the farmhouse window and watched the darkness beyond the tree line and thought about 3 days. She had Tish's message, delivered by a rider she did not recognize who had appeared at the farmhouse door at dawn and vanished before she could ask his name. And she had read it twice, and then held it in both hands and stood very still with the specific sensation of someone who has been falling and has just felt a handhold solidify under their fingers. The revocation had no standing. She was still Luna under Moon Law. She had 3 days to present herself to the Moon Council. She also had 3 trackers somewhere behind them on the road. The northern path through the ridge adds 2 hours, Thierry said from the table, where he had the map spread again, a candle at each corner. He had been studying it for 20 minutes with the focused attention of a man conducting a one-sided argument with geography. But it approaches the castle from the High Warden's Road, which is ceremonial territory. Trackers can't follow onto it without Moon Council permission. It puts you inside the protected approach. And the trackers? Aldous said. They're good, Thierry said, but they're from the western lowlands. The ridge path has 3 points that require knowledge of local terrain to navigate safely. Specifically, he tapped the map. Here, here, and here. He looked up. I grew up on this ridge. I can take us through all 3 in the dark. Margaret looked at him. He had been like this since Ashford Hollow, steady and practical and competent in a way that required no announcement, the way deep water is simply deep. She was not accustomed to being helped. She had spent 52 years being the one who helped, the one who managed, the one who held the pieces together when everyone else was dropping them. The experience of having someone simply look at the map and say, I know the way, was doing something to her chest that she was not yet ready to examine. 2 hours before dawn, she said. We move then. Thierry nodded. He began to roll the map. I need to tell you something, he said, without looking up. His voice had shifted, still even, but with a different weight in it, the weight of something that had been decided about. Tell me, she said. Mira told me 6 months ago what Caden and Dorian were building. He set the rolled map down. She told me about your husband, about Morgan, about the petition. She told me what was going to happen to you. He looked up then, and his gray eyes were steady and serious, and carrying something she recognized because she had carried it herself for a very long time. I should have come to you then, directly. I chose to wait until the proof was complete. I've been asking myself these past 3 days whether that was the right choice, whether if I'd come sooner. You couldn't have changed it, Margaret said. If you'd come to me 6 months ago with incomplete proof, Caden would have found out and accelerated everything. Mira was right to wait. So were you. Maybe, he said. But you walked into that hall alone. The simplicity of it, the plain, uncomplicated acknowledgement of what that had cost her, delivered without theater or performance, landed somewhere very specific and undefended. I've walked into rooms alone for 52 years, she said, and meant it lightly, and heard it come out as something else. Thierry looked at her for a moment. I know, he said quietly. I could see it, the way you stood there. My wife walked into rooms alone for the last 4 years of her life, because I didn't understand yet how to stand beside someone properly. I understood afterward, which is the most useless kind of understanding there is. Something moved in his jaw. I'm better at it now, in case that's worth saying. The farmhouse was very quiet. The candles on the table threw warm, unsteady light. Outside, the ridge wind moved through the trees with a low, patient sound. "It's worth saying," Margaret said. Pimiento, from his position by the hearth where he had been making what he described as a strategically important pot of stew, said, "I am going to hum something loudly for the next 30 seconds to give you both privacy," and proceeded to do exactly that. Despite everything, the trackers in the dark, the 3-day window, the Moon Council waiting, the weight of everything that had been done and everything that still needed doing, Margaret laughed. A real one, brief and startled and entirely unguarded. Thierry looked at the sound of it the way people look at something unexpected and valuable. Then Aldis's voice came from the doorway, sharp and low. "Movement in the tree line. 70 meters, at least 2. The laughter stopped. Everyone in the room moved at once. Guards to positions, Thierry to the map, Pimiento to the hearth to damp the fire's visibility, Margaret to the window. She could see them now. Shapes in the dark beneath the trees, moving with the careful, deliberate patience of trained trackers who were not yet certain of their target and were not going to commit until they were. "They're not sure we're here," she said. "They will be in 10 minutes, Aldis said. Thierry was already at her shoulder, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the solidity of his presence. The particular steadiness she was beginning to understand was not performance, but simply what he was. "The ridge path starts 20 meters behind this building," he said. "We go now. We have a lead. We go in 20 minutes, we don't." Margaret looked at the shapes in the tree line. She thought about the Moon Council. She thought about Leon, alone in that castle with Caden's teeth around him. She thought about the mirror's pulse, and the ancient voice saying 73 winters, "You took your time," and the warmth in her chest that had been growing steadily since the moment she pressed her palm to that floor stone and the world beneath it breathed. She thought about Alistair opening his mouth and closing it, and Morgaine's fingers on his arm, and the echo of that laugh in the great hall. "We go now," she said. She turned from the window, and Thierry was already moving, and the farmhouse door opened onto the cold night air, and behind them the trackers in the tree line stilled, sensing something, not sure what, and before them the ridge path rose into the dark, and Margaret walked into it without hesitating, and the darkness received her like something that had been expecting her all along. From somewhere ahead on the path, where Thierry was leading with the lamp held low, his voice came back to her, quiet and certain, and entirely unafraid. "Stay close. I know the way." She did. The ridge path was not a path so much as an intention, a suggestion made by generations of feet that had pressed themselves into the same reluctant earth and hoped for the best. It rose sharply from the farmhouse through dense pine, the ground uneven and wet from 3 days of cold rain, the darkness so complete that Thierry's lamp was the only fixed point in the world. Margaret moved behind him with her hand occasionally brushing the rock face to her right for orientation, her breath visible in the cold air, her body reminding her with considerable specificity that she was 73 years old and had not run from anything in recent memory. She ran anyway. Behind them, too close, already too close, she could hear the trackers moving through the undergrowth. Not loudly. That was the problem. A careless pursuer was manageable. These moved with the deliberate, adaptive quiet of people who did this professionally and had been given strong motivation to succeed. 40 meters, Aldis said from behind her, his voice barely above a breath. First technical point in 60 seconds, Thierry said ahead. He did not slow down. There is a ledge crossing, 3 feet wide, 40 feet of drop to the left. Do not look left. Keep your right hand on the rock and walk normal speed. Hesitation is more dangerous than the drop. Pimiento said, from somewhere in the middle of the group, with the focused calm of a man who had entirely rearranged his priorities. Absolutely not going to look left. Left doesn't exist. Left has never existed. The ledge came up exactly when Thierry said it would, the path narrowing without ceremony to a ribbon of wet stone, the right wall solid and reassuring, the left side opening into a darkness that had sound in it, the distant sound of water far below. Margaret pressed her right palm flat against the rock and walked. Steady. Even. Looking at Thierry's lamp ahead, and nothing else. The trackers reached the base of the ledge just as she cleared it. She heard them hesitate. A brief, rapid exchange in low voices, assessing, calculating, the way trained people assess unfamiliar terrain before committing. In the dark, on wet stone, without a guide who knew the path. "They'll come across," Thierry said. "But slower. We just bought 3 minutes." "Use them," Margaret said. He was already moving. The path climbed harder above the ledge, switchbacking up through rock outcroppings that Thierry navigated by memory. His lamp held low to avoid broadcasting their position to anyone watching from the castle ridge above. Margaret's lungs were burning, and she breathed through it with the same practice she had applied to every discomfort that had come for her in 73 years. Acknowledge, continue. Do not negotiate. Then, from ahead, from the direction they were moving toward, came light. Not lamplight, not firelight. Something colder and more deliberate, a pale blue-white glow that she recognized before her mind had fully processed it, because her chest recognized it first. The warmth of the seal flaring to life with a sudden, urgent intensity that stopped her feet for exactly 1 second. "That's the High Warden's Road," Thierry said. He had stopped, his lamp raised slightly, looking at the glow ahead with an expression she could not fully read in the dark. "It shouldn't be. That's not what the road normally looks like." "It's not the road," Margaret said. She was already moving toward it. The glow was coming from a stone marker at the road's edge, one of the ancient waymarkers that had stood at the boundary of the High Warden's ceremonial territory for as long as anyone could document, carved with the same symbols she had seen on the chamber walls beneath the kitchen. The symbols were lit from within, pale and cold and absolute, and as Margaret reached the marker and pressed her hand to it, the glow intensified, flared, and then spread, running like water along the road surface in both directions, illuminating the boundary of the protected approach with light that had nothing to do with fire or lamplight or anything human. The seal. The territory recognizing her. The ancient compact doing what it had been built to do. Behind them, she heard the trackers reach the top of the ledge path and stop. She turned. The 3 of them stood at the road's edge, on the wrong side of the glowing boundary, and their faces in the blue-white light were the faces of people who had just put their hands out to push a door and found a wall. The lead tracker was a large man, experienced in the particular way that shows in how someone holds their body, and he was looking at the boundary light with the expression of someone whose professional confidence had just been updated by new information. "You cannot cross this boundary without Moon Council sanction," Margaret said. She was breathing hard, but her voice was steady, and the light of the seal was behind her and around her, and she was standing on ground that knew her name. "You know what this road is. You know what the light means." The lead tracker looked at her, looked at the boundary. His jaw worked once. "Lady Morgane's orders. Lady Morgane," Margaret said, "has no authority that reaches onto ceremonial ground. Neither does Prince Caden. Neither does anyone who sent you tonight." She took 1 step toward the boundary's edge, still on her side, but close enough that the light intensified around her, casting her shadow backward and long. "Go back to the castle. Tell them you found the boundary active. Tell them exactly what that means." A long pause. Then the lead tracker did something she had not expected. He looked not at the boundary, but at her, directly, with the particular attention of someone seeing something clearly for perhaps the first time. And then, slowly, he pressed a fist to his chest. A gesture. Old. Instinctive. The gesture that wolves made to a Luna they recognized. He turned around. The other 2 followed. Their footsteps faded back down the ridge path and were swallowed by the dark. Pimiento exhaled so completely that it seemed to take several seconds. "I am going to need," he said to no one in particular, An extremely large breakfast. Tomorrow. Very early. Many eggs. But the night was not finished. They had been on the High Warden's Road for perhaps 20 minutes, the castle's towers beginning to resolve against the sky above them, when the sound of hooves came from ahead. Fast, urgent, a single rider pushing hard down the ceremonial road toward them, with no care at all for the dark or the terrain. Aldous had his hand on his weapon before the rider resolved into visibility. Leanne pulled his horse to a stop 3 feet from Margaret and was off it before the animal had fully settled, and he crossed the distance between them and took both her hands in his, and the expression on his face was the expression she had last seen when he was 7 years old and had lost her in the market and found her again. The expression of someone who had been holding something catastrophic at bay through sheer determined effort and had just been allowed to put it down. "I have maybe 30 minutes before Caden realizes I've gone," he said, without preamble. "The Moon Council session is at dawn. Elder Sylvain has called a formal hearing. All parties required to attend, no proxy permitted. Moon Law Authority." He was looking at her, her hands still in his, and his voice was controlled, but she could feel the shake under it. "It's over. Mira and I have the documents. Tish has the originals. Elder Sylvain already has copies. I had Tish send them directly to the council's clerk this evening." A breath. "All of it, Mother. The petition for accelerated succession, the arbiter documents, the correspondence between Caden and Dorian going back 11 months, all of it." "The Moon Council has it," Margaret said. "They have everything." She looked at her son, at the exhaustion in his face, the controlled fury, the love that had been carrying him through 3 days of performing a role that was the inverse of everything she had raised him to be. "You did well," she said. His jaw worked. He looked away for a moment, up at the castle towers against the pre-dawn sky, and the lights in the windows that burned too many and too bright for this hour, the lights of people who had been told something was happening and did not yet know what. "Caden doesn't know the Moon Council has the documents yet," Leon said, looking back. "He thinks he still has time. He's going to walk into that hearing, believing he's the one with the prepared position." Something sharp and fierce and utterly cold moved through his gray eyes. "He's going to be wrong." Then, from behind Margaret, came Thierry's voice, quiet and entirely steady. "Leon." Leon looked past his mother at the man standing behind her. Something moved across his face, recognition, relief, something warm and exhausted. "Lord Thierry, you brought her back safe." "She brought herself back safe," Thierry said. "I just knew the road." Leon looked between them for a moment, one of those assessing looks that he had learned from his mother and had apparently been using to considerable effect. And then he looked at Margaret with an expression that was, briefly, very close to something like hope. "The hearing is at dawn," he said. He glanced at the horizon, where the first impossibly thin line of gray was beginning to suggest itself. "That's approximately 40 minutes from now," Pimiento said. "I don't suppose there's a kitchen inside those walls where a man could—" "Pimiento," Margaret said. "Right. Yes, 40 minutes. Kitchens later. History first." He straightened, adjusted his apron, and then drew himself up to his full considerable height with an expression of absolute commitment. "Lead the way, Your Grace." Margaret looked up at Castle Veldmore, at its dark towers and its burning windows and its ancient stones that had held her for 52 years and had then thrown her out like something used up and finished. She felt the seal warm and certain in her chest. She felt the road solid beneath her feet, the road that knew her name and had lit itself to prove it. She felt Thierry one step behind her left shoulder, steady, unhurried, present, and Leon on her right, and the guards around them, and Pimiento somewhere behind announcing quietly to himself that he had faced worse mornings and would face this one with similar success, and she thought, "This is what it feels like to not be alone." Then she walked toward the castle gates, and the dawn came up behind her like something that had been waiting for permission, and the eternal moon seal burned in her chest like a fire that had never actually gone out, only been starved of the air it needed. And she was walking back into the place that had tried to erase her. And she was not afraid. And she was not broken. And she was not finished. She was, at 73 years old, precisely beginning. The great hall of Castle Veldmore had never felt so full. Every torch was lit. Every seat at the long council table was occupied. The Moon Council's 3 representatives sat at the table's head with their ledgers open and their pens ready, and the particular composed authority of people who had convened hearings like this before and understood that the drama of the moment was not theirs to perform. It was theirs to witness and record. Elder Sylvain sat in the center, her silver pen catching the torchlight, her face carrying nothing that could be used against her. Caden arrived first. He walked in with Dorian at his shoulder, and the expression of a man who had spent the night preparing a performance and was ready to deliver it. Confident, measured, the picture of a concerned firstborn son navigating a difficult family situation with admirable calm. He took his seat. He folded his hands. He did not look at the door. Morgaine came in separately, a deliberate 3 minutes later, in a gown that was not the garnet of the revocation ceremony, but something softer. A calculated adjustment, Margaret noted, reading the room before it had fully assembled. Morgaine understood optics. She always had. She sat beside Caden and touched nothing and looked at everything. King Alistair was helped to his chair by 2 attendants. He moved with the careful economy of a man whose body had been declining in ways he had been ignoring for months. The eastern forests thinning, the winter wolves moving west, the elder trees losing bark on the north side, the seal diminishing with each day the territory's Luna had been denied her place in it. He sat down heavily. His eyes moved to the door. Margaret walked in. She had taken 20 minutes in a room off the main corridor. Tish had appeared, impossibly and inevitably, with a clean dress, a comb, and an expression that communicated everything without a word. And she had pinned her silver hair into the same elegant knot she had worn for 52 years of mornings, and she had looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall, and she had recognized the woman looking back. Not the woman of 6 months ago, moving through the castle on the careful paths of the managed and overlooked. This woman had been in a chamber older than the castle itself and heard her name spoken by something ancient. This woman had crossed a ledge in the dark above a 40-foot drop without looking left. This woman had watched the territory light itself beneath her feet. She walked to her seat. Not the visitor's chair, not the side position, but the Luna's chair, to the right of the throne, the chair that Moonlaw said was still hers. And she sat in it, and she did not look at Alistair, and she did not look at Morgaine, and she folded her hands on the table the way she had folded them in 1,000 councils over 52 years. And she waited. Caden's composure developed its first crack within 60 seconds. It was the chair. The fact that she had simply sat in it, without asking, without ceremony, without any acknowledgement that there had ever been a question about whether it was hers. Elder Sylvain opened the hearing. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She simply read, in her clear, carrying voice, from the documents that Tish and Leon had assembled, that Mira had been quietly building for 6 months, that the mirror in the chamber beneath the kitchen had shown Margaret in a flash of blue-white light on the worst morning of her life. She read the petition for accelerated succession, signed 11 months ago. She read the arbiter correspondence. She read the dates, each date a stone laid on the table, building something that could not be unbuilt. And she read Dorian's name and Caden's name, and she read the clause in the correspondence where Caden had written, in his own careful script, the Luna must be removed before the petition is filed, or she will contest it under Compact Article 7, and we lose everything. He had known. He had known about Article 7. He had known his mother could fight this, and he had worked to ensure she could not. The hall was absolutely silent. Dorian stood up. He was very good. She gave him that. His voice was steady, and his argument was constructed, and he had clearly prepared for the possibility of exposure, had prepared a counter-narrative about the territory's welfare and the king's declining capacity and the necessity of, someone had to, the responsibility of. Elder Sylvain let him speak for 45 seconds. Then she said mildly, "Lord Dorian, are you currently occupying an official position in this territory that grants you standing to address this hearing?" "I am Lady Morgaine's—" "Lady Morgaine," Elder Sylvain said, "holds no title recognized under Moon Law, as the Lunabond she claims is predicated on a revocation that has no standing, which means you are a private citizen addressing a Moon Council formal hearing without standing." She looked at him over the ledger. "Please sit down." He sat down. Caden said, "The petition was filed in good faith." "The petition was filed in secret," Leon said, from his seat across the table, and his voice was so precisely and carefully controlled that the fury inside it was audible only to people who knew exactly what to listen for. 11 months ago, while my mother was running this territory, while my father was occupied. He looked at Caden directly and held it. "You didn't believe in the territory's welfare, Caden. You believed in the throne. Those are not the same thing." Caden looked back at his brother. Something behind his eyes moved, and for one moment, one single suspended moment, Margaret saw it. Not the ambitious architect, not the careful conspirator, but the boy underneath it all. The boy who had decided very young that the only safe thing was to want power before power could be taken from him. She had known that boy. She had tried, more times than she could count, to reach him. She had not been enough. She accepted that now, finally, with the particular clean grief of understanding something that could not be changed. "Alistair," she said. The room went still. It was the first time she had spoken, and it was his name. Just his name, not his title. The name she had spoken 10,000 times in private over 52 years. And it landed on him the way she knew it would. He looked at her. His hands on the table were not steady. "You have one thing left to do," she said quietly. "One thing that is yours to do and no one else's. Abdicate cleanly in accordance with Moon Law, in favor of the son who deserves it." She looked at him without anger, without softness, without any of the residue of 52 years that she had spent the ridge path and the night and the morning burning through. "Not Caden. You know which son." Alistair looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Leon. His throat moved, his hands pressed flat on the table. "And King Alistair of Veldmore, 81 years old, Alpha King of the Eastern Reaches, who had been a fool and a fantosh, and a man who had opened his mouth in the Great Hall and let Morgana's fingers close it, said, in a voice that was old and rough and entirely his own, 'I abdicate the throne of Veldmore in favor of my son, Prince Leon, in the presence of the Moon Council as witness.'" Elder Sylvain's pen moved. It was done. What followed was not loud. The great machinery of consequence moved with the quiet efficiency of systems that had been designed for exactly this. The Moon Council's clerk documenting, the representatives witnessing, the formal words exchanged in the language of old compact and older law. Caden sat through it with the stillness of a man whose prepared position had been removed from under him so thoroughly that there was nothing left to push against. Dorian did not speak again. Morgane sat beside Caden with her hands folded and her face perfectly composed and her dark eyes doing the rapid, continuous work of someone calculating what was still salvageable. Elder Sylvain looked at her, at the end, with the expression of a woman who had seen this calculation before. "Lady Morgane," she said, "the Moon Council will be conducting a full review of the circumstances that preceded this hearing. You will make yourself available for that process. I would encourage you to cooperate fully. The review will proceed regardless." Morgane looked at Elder Sylvain for exactly 1 moment. Then she dropped her gaze, and in the dropping of it said everything she would not say aloud. "Leon was named Alpha King of Veldmore before the morning was fully light. Mira stood beside him during the Moon Council's acknowledgement, straight and clear-eyed and calm, the way she always was. The way that was not softness, but something Margaret had come to understand was the specific strength of a person who had decided long ago that clarity was more useful than performance. She looked at Margaret across the table and gave her the smallest nod, and Margaret returned it, and between those two nods passed everything that did not need to be said. Tish, standing near the wall in her habitual position of perfect useful invisibility, allowed herself one small private smile. Pimiento, standing just outside the council chamber door because no one had explicitly told him he could come in, put his head around the doorframe at the moment of Leon's acknowledgement and said, in a carrying whisper, "Should I start the breakfast now, or—" And Aldous, at his shoulder, very quietly and with great feeling, said, "Yes." Alistair left the castle that afternoon, quietly, with 2 attendants and a traveling bag, and none of the ceremony of arrival. Margaret watched from the window of the upper corridor, not with satisfaction, not with grief, but with the specific, exhausted clarity of someone who has set down something very heavy and is learning what her hands feel like without it. He did not look up. She did not expect him to. Caden rode out an hour later. The Moon Council's review of his role in the petition would proceed in his absence if necessary, and Elder Sylvain had been very clear about the consequences of non-cooperation. He left without speaking to Leon. He did not speak to Margaret. He rode toward the eastern road with Dorian beside him, and the particular quality of someone who has decided that forward is the only direction left. She did not watch him go. Thierry found her in the castle garden at dusk, the kitchen garden specifically, the one she had planted in her second year as Luna, and had tended in fragments of spare time ever since, the one that smelled of rosemary and cold earth and late-season thyme. She was standing at its center with her hands at her sides, not doing anything, just standing in it, feeling the specific texture of ground that she had tended and that had continued, through everything, to grow. He stopped at the garden gate. He did not come in without being asked. She noticed that. "Mira tells me," he said, "that the Moon Council representative wants to speak with you tomorrow about formally reinstating the seal's acknowledgement. She says it will take about an hour and involves saying some words in old tongue and pressing your hand to something." "I know the room," Margaret said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The dusk was settling, soft and cold, the kind of dusk that smells of wood smoke and coming winter. "I'm going to go home next week, back to the border reach. Mira and Leon will want to establish their own rhythm here, and I think—" Another pause. "I think the territory benefits from having the border properly managed, especially in the transition." She turned to look at him. He was standing at the gate with his hands wrapped around its top bar, and his gray eyes on her and the last of the dusk light on his face. And he was being, as he always seemed to be, entirely honest about what he was doing and why. "You're asking me something," she said. "I'm going home," he said. "And I'm telling you where home is, in case, at some point, you wanted to know where to find me." He met her eyes steadily. "That's all I'm saying. The rest is entirely yours." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had known the road in the dark, who had said she brought herself back safe and meant it as a compliment and not a diminishment, who had told her, without theater, that he had once failed to stand beside someone properly and had spent years learning how. "Rosemary keeps well through winter," she said, "if you know how to pack it." Something in his face became very still and then very warm. "I do," he said. She turned back to the garden. He stayed at the gate a moment longer, and then the gate opened, and his footsteps came across the garden path, and he stopped beside her, not in front, not behind, but beside. And they stood together in the last of the evening light while the castle above them settled into its new shape, and the seal in Margaret's chest burned steady and clear and full, and the rosemary smelled of everything that was still growing. End of chapter 10. Epilogue. 1 year later, the elder trees along the north face of the Veldmore Ridge bloomed for the first time in recorded memory. The foresters who discovered it sent a report to the new Alpha King, who read it at the breakfast table and passed it to his wife without comment, because Mira had predicted it 6 months earlier, and he had learned that Mira's predictions were worth simply confirming rather than being surprised by. Leon ruled with the particular quality of a man who had spent a year pretending to be someone he wasn't, and had emerged from it knowing precisely who he was. He was fair, and he was thorough, and he made decisions the way his mother had always made them, sitting with them long enough to understand them, then committing fully and not looking back. The Moon Council noted, in their annual territorial assessment, that the Eternal Moon Seal had registered its strongest reading in 4 generations. Tish was named head of Castle Intelligence, a role that Elder Sylvain suggested be formalized and that Leon agreed to immediately, and that Tish accepted with the composure of someone who had essentially been doing the job for years without the title. She moved out of the servants' quarters into rooms of her own in the East Wing, and was occasionally heard, in the corridors, conducting conversations that the people she was talking to did not realize were interviews. Pimiento remained head cook. He attempted to retire twice, and on both occasions was persuaded otherwise by the combined argument of everyone in the castle who had tasted his bread, which was everyone in the castle. He accepted this with the dignity of a man who knew himself to be essential and had made his peace with it. He also, quietly and without announcement, began teaching the kitchen apprentices everything he knew, which turned out, when inventoried, to be considerably more than cooking. Caden returned 8 months later, under the conditions of the Moon Council's review. He came without Dorian, who had found other territories to occupy, and he stood before the council and gave his accounting, and what Margareth saw in him then was not the boy she had tried to reach or the architect she had learned to fear, but something reduced and clarified, a man who had reached the end of the road his ambition had built and found nothing there, and was now, slowly and without any guarantee of success, trying to learn to want something different. She did not forgive him on a schedule. Forgiveness was not a schedule. But she did not close the door, and he noticed, and that was where they left it. Morgaine left the Eastern Territories entirely. Alistair spent his remaining months in a house at the territory's southern edge, tended by the 2 attendants who had accompanied him, and occasionally visited by a Moon Council welfare assessor who reported, in their dry official language, that the former king was in declining health and appeared to have arrived, somewhat late, at a reckoning with his own choices. He sent Margaret a letter once that said very little and meant she understood, considerably more than it said. She read it twice. She put it in a drawer. She did not write back, but she did not burn it either, and that was all she could honestly offer. In the border reach, in the house that smelled of cedar and wood smoke, and the particular cold clarity of winter coming in off the ridge, Thierry received a letter in October that contained, along with news of the Moon Council's annual assessment and the elder trees blooming and Leon's new governance appointments, a single pressed sprig of rosemary and no explanation. He read the letter twice, then held the rosemary for a moment, and then set it in the window where the light would catch it, and he wrote back the same day. A letter that was practical and specific, and said, between its practical and specific lines, something that required no translation. She arrived the following spring, when the border road was clear and the light was the particular gold of a season beginning, with a traveling bag and Pimiento, who had invited himself on the grounds that someone needed to assess the kitchen situation, and the easy, unhurried certainty of a woman who had spent 73 years finding out what she was made of and had finally arrived somewhere worth being. Thierry opened the gate before she reached it. "I know," she said, stepping through, "that you know the road." "I do," he said, "but I find I prefer it when we're walking the same one." The gate closed behind her. Pimiento, evaluating the kitchen from the doorway, announced that the situation was manageable, and that he had brought rosemary. Somewhere in the old compact between territory and Luna, between root and stone and the slow work of what endures, The eternal moon seal registered something it had not recorded in any of its 400 years of continuous service. It recorded contentment. And if you're listening to this story now, if it found you on a night when you needed to hear about a woman who was thrown away and came back blazing, who found a door in a kitchen floor and walked through it, who stood on a dark ledge above a 40-foot drop and kept her eyes forward, then you already know why we tell stories like this one. Not to pretend the hurt didn't happen, but to remind ourselves what happens after. Tell me in the comments, which moment hit you hardest? Was it the Great Hall, the mirror in the dark, the ridge path at midnight, or the rosemary in the window? And if you want more stories about women who were underestimated, worlds that have long memories, and love that arrives exactly when it's supposed to, stay close. There are more.